Hello, everybody. So nice to be with all of you. Today, my name is Seth Braunstein. For anybody who's watching today who does not know me, I have been involved in Camp Sarvash since 2005. And I am the director of the program that brings all of the students to Sarvash every summer from North America, which is called the Sarvash Fellowships. And over the last number of years, I have also served as the camp rabbi as well. So today, we're going to have an opportunity to be able to look at some texts together and to be able to actually delve in a little bit and to really think about what is the holiday of Shavuot. What is the experience of the actual receiving of the Torah at Sinai, at Mount Sinai? And we're going to talk through some of those texts. I encourage anybody who's watching now, there should be a link to all of the text through Sefaria, which should be posted up there on Facebook. And there's also a direct link to actually be able to come in and to be able to actually join us on Zoom and to be able to be in the conversation. So in just a moment, I'm going to put up the text and we're going to begin. I'm going to share my screen here with all of you. Great. So as we see here on top, traditionally, the holiday of Shavuot is known actually as the holiday of receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai, at Har Sinai. But if we look back into the Torah, the holiday itself is actually a holiday that is actually agricultural, and actually it calls us back to the moment of the bringing of the first fruits to the temple in Jerusalem. But the rabbis actually understand the holiday to also be, and traditionally today is like how we really mostly experience it, is to actually be a holiday of remembering the actual moment of the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And as you will see also as well, there are a number of customs of the holiday of Shavuot. We're not going to be spending too much time today on like all of those different customs. But as you see, and you're probably quite familiar, there is a custom to actually stay up all night and study and learn on Shavuot night, to actually like relive, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to actually talk about that a little bit later as well, to be able to actually relive that moment at Sinai of receiving the Torah. And the other is eating dairy, and the other is actually reading the book of Ruth, which actually took place during the harvest season. So let's now jump in to our text. And again, if you click into Zoom, right on top there in the link, you will be able to access to come directly into the class and to be able to actually be part of the conversation, which would be really, really wonderful. So people aren't just watching, but they could actually be part of this conversation here together. And the other is you can click in to the link to be able to access all the text through Sefaria. If you have any issues, you could absolutely join in, or you can message, and there'll be somebody who can be able to help you with that. So let's jump in here to the first text that we have. If we look actually in a text called the Mara Nevuchim, which is the guide for the Perplexed, which is written by Maimonides. He has a beautiful, beautiful insight on like, what is this holiday? What is this anticipation to actually coming to Shavuot? And he paints a beautiful picture here. I am going to choose to read all the text in English. If people join, I would love to have people join and to be able to actually read the text as well besides me. But I'm not going to read them in Hebrew for the interest of the audience and time and so on, but all of the text, I believe all of them are also here in Hebrew as well. And I tried to highlight in bold all of the main points that we're hoping to cover over the course of our time together over the next hour. So let's jump into the first text. So the Feast of Weeks is the anniversary of the revelation on Mount Sinai, which obviously we already know that Shavuot is also called in English. The Feast of Weeks is the anniversary of this moment of the revelation, of the receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. In order to raise the importance of this day, we count the days that pass since the preceding festival, just as one who expects his or her most intimate friend on a certain day counts the days and even the hours. So this moment, according to the Rambam, according to Maimonides, right, we count. The Omer is an experience that we've been counting up the days from the second day of Pesach, of Passover, 49 days, and there's all different explanations of the Omer. We're not going to spend time here in this class today on the Omer of that counting, but he says that part of that counting experience is actually counting up and counting actually towards the experience of the revelation at Sinai. Just like if we were counting down the days to camp, which I know is a lot harder this year because it's not going to be happening in the same way, right? But like counting down to a moment that we like really, really look forward to. It's not only something that happened then, and we're going to talk all about this over the next time that we have together, but actually the experience of Shavuot is supposed to be like reliving that moment of like actually of Har Sinai. And so we count the 49 days, and then on the 50th day is the holiday of Shavuot. And so we ourselves are supposed to be experiencing that. Let's now continue to our next text here that we have. One moment. Great. So the next text here that we have is from the Torah, from Shmot, from Exodus, that actually begins to tell the story about what was happening around these days leading up to the revelation, to the receiving of the Torah. So it says, B'chodesh hashlishi, so in the third month. Why did it say in the third month? I think it's a great question to ask, because traditionally we might think of the first month as Tishrei, as the beginning of Rosh Hashanah, at the beginning of the year. But this is actually the third month of the year according to the Torah, and the beginning of the year starts in the month of Nisan. There's all different beginnings of the year. In Tractate Rosh Hashanah, it talks about all different types of starts of the year, which is not for our class now, but it's also an important thing to be aware of. So at the beginning of the third month, on the third moon, after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on this very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Having journeyed from Rephidim, they entered the wilderness of Sinai and encamped in the wilderness. Israel encamped there in front of the mountain. And Moshe went up to God. The Lord called to him from the mountain, and he said, "Thus you should go and say to the people, You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I took you out from the land. Now then, we're now in verse 5. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, and we're going to talk about that word covenant or brit, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine. But you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And we're going to skip a little bit. All the people answered as one people. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moshe brought back the people's words to God. So what's going on here? We're going to actually unpack a few of the ideas here in the text to talk about a little bit before we continue and we move forward. So there are actually a couple of different points that I want to spend together here with you and look into. The first of those points is actually in the first verse. It says, on this very day. You could translate it also, and we'll open up the Hebrew as well so people can see, by Yom Hazeh. It could be translated on that day. We're going to look in just a moment at a midrash, and I'll also explain what a midrash is in just a few moments before we do our next text. But it says, by Yom Hahu, on this very day, or on that very day. And the interpretation in the midrash, which we're going to see in a little bit, is going to say that on this day, not on that day, again, talking about how we opened, about us actually trying to relive that moment of the revelation at Mount Sinai. The next piece of this text that I'd like to call out to everybody is that right, all the people had responded together as one. And as we know, as Jews, that's not always so common for people to answer together as one. And we're going to come back to this idea also a little bit later. Ki ish echad b'lev echad, as we probably know, as one people, as one nation together. And it's quite rare to be able to have a moment actually that's like that. Often when I'm in Sarvash, I actually feel that moment. I feel that moment of being together as a nation of people coming from across the world, like being together, like as one, with one heart, with a common mission together to really create that experience. So for me, it's like almost strange, but I almost actually feel like reliving that when I'm actually in Sarvash in the summer. So that's one other point that I want to call out to us. And the last one is the idea of a covenant, of a brit. Now, easily, we could have just been given the Torah. God could have just given the Torah to the people, but no, they entered into a covenant. And we know that there's also talk of covenants earlier in the Torah with Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov and so on. We're not going to talk about that here, but they enter here into a covenant. And it says, if you will obey me faithfully and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Right? So a covenant, and feel free to comment there on Facebook. I'm not able to actually see it, but feel free to actually share your thoughts on that idea. Right? What does it mean to have a covenant? What does the word covenant mean? It's not one-sided, it's actually two-sided, right? When there are two people who are actually involved in something, right? It's bilateral, not unilateral. And that's actually a really important piece of the experience of Sinai, that it's not just God giving something to the people, but it's the people who are choosing to receive something from God, which calls out to us that, right, it's us who need to actually opt in to that experience. So those are the few pieces that I really wanted to look at in the first text together with you, which is kind of like the introduction of what's going to be happening in the actual moment of the revelation and the receiving of the Torah at Har Sinai. The other question I'll sort of throw out, and people could definitely comment there also if you want on Facebook, is what does it mean actually to be actually to be kadosh, to be a holy nation? What does it mean? What's that call to us? What's that asking us to be holy people? What do you think the word holy means? What does it mean to be a holy person? Feel free to comment there in Facebook. Let's continue here to the next text, which comes from a midrash, and this is not a class on kind of going in to the depths of what the concept and idea of midrash. Perhaps we'll be able to explore that at another time. But the idea is, like, the whole idea of midrash is a rabbinic interpretation, usually generally either at the time of the writing of the Mishnah to and around the time of the writing of the Talmud, from about the year 200 to about the year 500, is around the time when like classical midrashim were written. So we're going to take a look at here together at a midrash. What does it mean? And we didn't actually talk about this. And Israel encamped, Vayichan Sham Yisrael, in verse number 2. What does he say here? And Israel encamped there. Elsewhere it is written, and they journeyed, and they encamped. They journeyed in quarrel and encamped in quarrel. Quarrel is like to fight or to argue. Here, they were of one heart, lev echad. Wherefore it is written, and it encamped, and Israel encamped there. The idea is that generally, if you actually read in the Chumash, as the Jews are traveling and you hear about all the different places where they travel and stop and settle, it uses that language. And if you see in the Hebrew here in the highlighted piece, it's actually Vayisa'u, let's scroll back down, and Vayachanu. But here it just says Vayachanu. So they didn't journey, but they just encamped. And the understanding is that and Israel encamped there, that they were whole, that they were of one people together, and that it was not a moment of quarrel or of argument. There are some questions here below that I encourage you again to click on the text and to look at. Why do you think that the nation is able to speak with a single voice and appear united in this moment? As we said earlier, ki ish echad belev echad, like one person with one heart. And again, I encourage you, please, to type anything there in the comments on Facebook. It would be wonderful for other people to be able to see your thoughts actually there. And the other question that I'd like to pose, to also be able to write in the comments there on Facebook, is why does the Torah use the language of brit or covenant? What does it signify that word of covenant, of brit, is used, that it's not one-sided? There's actually a beautiful idea, if anyone's familiar with the work of Martin Buber. He talks about two different relationships. One is I, it, and the other is I, thou. We've absolutely talked about this idea over the years in camp, right? Very, very briefly, I, it is about a relationship that's, right, to a person. It's not an intimate or deep relationship, right? I, it. I, thou is a much deeper kind of a relationship between people. A covenant is a relationship between God and the Jewish people. If you will, it's more of an I, thou type of a relationship, to use the language of Martin Buber. The next two questions here, as I'm scrolling down, is why does the text say on that, or as I said, on this day? And we're going to explore again a midrash here below to look into that a little bit. And the last question here is, why is the Torah given in the midbar, in the wilderness? Right? It's practical in terms of the story that they were traveling in the wilderness after they came out of Egypt and were traveling right, like, to the land of Israel. But what we're going to do here is to try to dig a little bit deeper as to what does it mean that it was actually given in the midbar, in the wilderness. So let's take a look together at the next piece of text. And this is actually a midrash that is not so often looked at. It's called Psikta Durov Kahana. And it's actually a midrash which is written a little bit later. I believe it's actually written more in the times of the Talmud, around 400 to 500, give or take. And let's jump into these two texts here together, which is going to try to answer the two questions above. If you can do the Hebrew, I encourage you to read it in Hebrew. It's really beautiful in the Hebrew language. It comes out much richer, as it always does. I'll try to perhaps incorporate some of the Hebrew as we're going. So, why was the Torah given in the wilderness of Sinai? Right? That is the question that we asked above. The answer is to teach that if a person does not make him or herself, right? I also translated from him to also include him or herself here, ownerless, like the wilderness, and we'll unpack this in a moment, he or she will not be able to acquire words of Torah. I'm going to read that one more time. I'm going to do it in Hebrew, actually. She'im ein adam mevaker atzmo kamidbar haze'eno zoche l'divrei Torah. Very, very powerful statement, right? If a person is not able to actually make themselves ownerless like the wilderness, they will not be able to acquire words of Torah. And the word actually acquire is used often in terms of Torah, that it's not just about, like learning or studying, but actually it's about acquiring Torah and actually like having your own personal relationship and ownership of Torah. Let's take a look at the end of this text here together. Even as the wilderness has no end, so the Torah has no end. As is said, to quote from Eov, from Job, its measure is longer than the earth and broader than the sea, talking about the midbar, the wilderness. Even as the Torah has no end, so there is no end to the reward for it, right? There's no end for the reward. It's trying to draw on the image or the experience of what a desert, of what a midbar is. As is said, how abundant is the good that you have in store for those who fear you. What does that mean to make yourself ownerless like the wilderness? You will not be able to acquire words of Torah. And again, a question here, please, if you're not in the Zoom here together with us, please feel free to actually type in the comments on Facebook here as well. What does it mean to make yourself ownerless like the wilderness? I'd like to argue here that perhaps it's about stepping out of our place of comfort, right? Again, it's practically it was in the wilderness because they were traveling along in the desert. But let's try to understand what is that kind of experience in the desert. It's often stepping out of a place of comfort to uncomfortability. I would encourage everybody here who's watching to take a moment, think about if you've slept in the desert, in any area of the world, or even more specifically in Israel. What was that like? What was that experience like? Especially if you were either on your own or with a small group of people, but even if you were together with a lot of people, right? It felt vast. It felt unending. It also felt pure, clean, right? What does it mean to actually make yourself into a wilderness to be able to actually receive and acquire the Torah? I'll actually share with you at this moment, around 2000, I actually traveled to Egypt, to Sinai, with a couple of close friends. And I actually went to we don't actually know what Sinai is, but actually to Muslim tradition, there is a mountain which is actually called Gabe Musa, what's known as Har Sinai. I traveled to Egypt, to Cairo, on an overnight bus for 12 hours, which is actually, it's quite hard now to be able to travel there through Gaza. And I actually went and I hiked up all night long, and we got to the top of Har Sinai, of Mount Sinai, in the middle of Sinai, of the desert, at dawn. And we actually experienced the sun coming up. I was with hundreds of other tourists from around the world. And for me, it was a very profound moment. Obviously, it doesn't really matter if that was the place or not, but actually, I actually felt that moment, and I actually tried to think about what that moment was like. And in a couple of minutes, we're going to continue to read about what that actual moment was. And I tried to really think about that and to think about what that actually would have been like. So if you've had a moment where you were in the desert, where you were had that experience, again, feel free to comment actually in the chat on Facebook. Let's take a look together at the next text here that we have, which is asking the question of Bayom Hazeh, on this day. What does that actually mean on this day? So we're going to take this one also in English. On this day, they came to the wilderness of Sinai. By on this day, can scripture or can Torah possibly mean that the children of Israel arrived in the wilderness today? Today? No. What God is saying in this verse is this: when you study my words of Torah, they are not to seem antiquated, like old or ancient to you, but as fresh as though the Torah were given this day. We're not going to get into all the rest of this text here. You're totally welcome to look at it on your own. Again, you can click the text on top from Sefaria to be able to access all of these texts, and you can be able to save them afterwards. And of course, you could reach out to me personally as well to continue the conversation, but also to talk about these specific texts. But what is this saying here? It's a beautiful idea. It means on this day, right, is about actually tomorrow night, right, and the next day, right? Like tomorrow night and Friday is the first night or day of Shavuot. If you're in Israel, you only have one, although actually everyone has two this year because of Shabbat. But right on that night when we are trying to re-experience it, but what it's actually saying is that it's not just on Shavuot. Every time we study Torah, when you actually study my words of Torah, they are not to seem antiquated, old, but as fresh as though the Torah was given on that day. So to actually, every time we open up a text or we're learning a text, we should actually feel as if it's actually fresh. I also wanted to actually think about, what does that mean? What does that mean that the Torah, right, is fresh every time we experience it, by Yom Hahu? So it's not just about the actual experience on Shavuot, but it's the experience that we have every time we actually acquire or study Torah ourselves. And I think that something really important before we go on to the next piece of this class here is what I'm trying to really call out to all of us, and I also include myself there, is that right, the actual experience of Har Sinai, and whatever we think about it, even if we ourselves question it or aren't even sure, right, it's about a relived experience of our people together. And it's about being together as one people, but even more so, it's also about an individual experience, right? Ki ish echad belev echad, as one person with one heart. And like, what does that mean for ourselves individually? And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end, to actually acquire and actually think about how we can have our own ownership over Torah in actually studying and actually like engaging in that experience. So let's continue here. Is the experience of revelation. And I entitled it Sensory Overload. So let's jump in here. But and the Lord said to Moshe, I will come to you in a thick cloud in order that the people may hear when I speak with you, and so trust you ever after. Right here, the clear message in the introduction here from God to Moshe here is that I am going to speak this. This will be an experience through sound, through voice, that I am going to be speaking to the people. And the question here is, right, what does that mean, voice? Question one here below. How would the experience of receiving the Torah audibly or out loud differ from the experience of receiving it visually? What is the difference between hearing and seeing? And we're going to talk about that idea in just a few minutes in terms of the actual description of the moment and of the experience, like actually of the revelation and of receiving the Torah. And question two here is, which sense, which of your senses, seeing or hearing, do you think would provide for a more powerful experience of revelation? Can you think of an example from your own experience as to which is more powerful for you? I encourage you to think about, a camp-wide evening experience in the Kupola, thanks to the, incredible tech team. And maybe I'll talk about this actually a little bit later, that we actually reenacted this in camp in the middle of the night a couple of years ago. Like, what does it mean to see? Is it easier to see, to hear? What happens if it's actually an all-encompassing experience of seeing and also hearing? And how does that impact the experience? So let's continue here in our text. So Vayehi, Vayom Hashlishi, on the third day, right? There were like 3 days that happened right before that they were preparing, and it's actually called Shloshet Yemei Hagbala, or these 3 days in preparation for the receiving. We are in that now. That's actually the 3 days before Shavuot, and there's certain customs and things that people do in those 3 days, actually leading up to Shavuot, to that moment. On the third day, at the morning, at dawn, there was a thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain, and a very loud blast of the horn, which is obviously alahar v'kol, the kol shofar chazak me'od, and the sound of the shofar was very, very strong. Vayechared kol ha'am asher b'machaneh. And then all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moshe led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. They moved forward for this experience. They came forward, and there's different understandings of what it means, the foot of the mountain. There's an idea even that God held the mountain above them here in the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat. I think it's on page 88. That's coming up soon for anyone who's studying the Daf Yomi, which is quite interesting and quite nice how that happens, which is actually studying a page of Talmud every day. Anyway, now Mount Sinai was all in smoke. So imagine what's happening, the sound, the thunder, the lightning, all these things happening. For the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, right? A kiln is how you make pottery, right? It's really, really hot, and the whole mountain trembled violently and shook. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder, which is obviously the blare of the shofar. As Moshe spoke, God answered him in thunder. It's a good question. What does it mean that God answered him in thunder? Some people say, right, when you hear thunder, is that God speaking to us? There's a blessing for lightning, for thunder. We've actually had that experience in camp together, usually in Mifkad. If there's a crazy rainstorm and we could be outside for a small bit, we actually have joined together to be able to actually say that blessing together. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moshe to the top of the mountain, and Moshe went up. What I want to let's actually continue into the next text here together. And this is actually really important. And if anyone was in camp a couple of years ago when we actually reenacted this, feel free to comment on it again in the chat. This is interactive. If you were in the Zoom, you could interact and talk, but I really want this to be interactive. I want people to actually type in the chat so people can be in conversation and in dialogue around these ideas. If you remember actually being in camp when we reenacted this in the middle of the night, I believe we had parts of it all around the camp to actually re-experience what it was like to come out actually from Egypt. Thanks to the incredible tech team, it actually worked well. So here it says, V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. And I'm reading this on purpose in Hebrew because we're going to actually unpack this in just a moment. Ro'im et hakolot, ve'et halapidim, ve'et kol hashofar. All the people witnessed or saw the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn of the shofar, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moshe, and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. They just really wanted to hear this message directly from Moshe as the intermediary in between. We're going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about what that means actually, like obey and nishma. We're going to talk about that towards the end of our class. What does it mean, ro'im et ha-kolot? I have always been fascinated by this idea. And again, feel free to write there in the comments in the chat. What does it mean to see sound, right? We hear sound, right? We don't see sound, we hear sound. So what does that mean, ro'im et ha-kolot? So we're going to take a look here at a midrash, and this is also shared in the Sfat Emet as well, who's a Hasidic Rebbe, but we're not going to use his particular source, but he delves into this in depth about what does it mean to actually see what you're hearing and be totally encompassed by an experience. So let's take a look at the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, and let's take a look how he interprets this. V'chol ha'am ro'im et hakolot. And all the people saw the sounds and the lightnings. They saw what was visible and heard what was audible. These are the words of Rabbi Ishmael. But let's look at the words of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva said, they saw and heard what was audible. There was nothing that left the mouth of the omnipotent, which refers to God, which was not inscribed on the tablets, etc., etc. Right? So, two questions here. What was God trying to accomplish with this kind of a multi-sensory experience of revelation at Sinai? And like just reading this text and not like I tried to do it in a more excited way, like trying to imagine what that experience was like. That's how it needs to be read. I've actually been places on Shavuot where I heard people doing like almost like a reenactment of the reading. It actually reminds me on each year on Pesach, right? We all read in the Passover Seder, B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. That a person is supposed to see themselves as if they came out of Egypt. Probably many of us have heard of that idea, right? To sort of reenact. That's the whole point of the evening of the Seder experience, is to reenact those moments and that experience. But probably like we know less that we're supposed to do the same with the experience of Har Sinai on Shavuot. So what does it mean, again, to see what was heard? I'm going to throw that question out. I encourage you also to write comments in the chat. What does it mean to see what was heard? What does it mean to have an all-encompassing experience? And as I said, the Sfat Emet talks about this idea in a deeper way. And I think that often our communication sometimes with people can be, right, when we really connect to someone, right, we could almost see and feel what they're actually saying, right? It's a deeper kind of a relationship when we really internalize what a person is saying to us. We're going to continue on here. So we're going to sort of come to our conclusion, into our final few texts here that we have together, and we'll be done by the end of the hour is our plan. So the next, it's 3 here on the sheet, but it's actually really from 2 different places in the text that we have here. So the next one is, and the question that I put here, like as the heading is, what should each of our own relationship be to Torah, right? We've been talking over the last 45 minutes or so, like what was this experience, right? It was about like people who were really present, this sort of all-encompassing experience, being in the midbar, kind of like stepping out of a comfort place. What does it mean to be in the midbar? All these types of ideas surrounded the experience of the receiving of the Torah itself. And the question that I want to pose to myself and to everyone else is like to me each year on Shavuot, like it's calling out to us and asking us, what is our own type of relationship to Torah? Like how do we own our own Torah? How do we engage with it? What speaks to us? What kind of text speak to us? And I'll try to close with a few ideas and kind of thoughts around this at the end. So let's take a look at the next source. And this comes from Devarim, Parshat Re'eh, I believe, which we actually usually read towards the end of the summer, maybe in the 3rd session of camp, depending on the year. And it says as follows. I'm going to read some in Hebrew and English, and we'll translate as well. And everyone can hopefully be able to see the text here in front of them. Surely this instruction which I enjoin upon you, enjoin is like I kind of like put upon you this day, is not too baffling. Baffling also like confusing, I guess you could translate it as, for you, nor is it beyond reach. In Hebrew, ki mitzvah hazot asher anochi mitzavcha hayom lo nifleti mimcha v'lo rechokahi. There's actually a beautiful song to this as well. Feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to share it with you. Or I'm sure you could reach out to Rabbi Jolt, who taught last week so wonderfully, and I'm sure he's got a great version, or could even be able to actually sing it himself, actually quite beautifully. Lo bashamayim hi, right? It is not in the heavens that you should say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it. Neither is it beyond the sea, the lo me'ever layam hi, that you should say, who among us can cross to the other side of the sea and get it for us and impart it to us that we may observe it. There are 4 points, I believe, that are being said here. Point number 1 is that the Torah itself is not too confusing, too baffling, too far away from us to access. Number 2 is it's not beyond reach, right? Lo rechoka, it's not beyond our access point. Number 3, lo bashamayim hi, it's not like, like in the heavens. And there's so much more to say on this that we can study. I think we've even studied in camp at some point. It's not for now. But like what is that actual experience? Like what does that mean? Lo bashamayim hi, but right, that it's not actually in heaven. So next is right that it's not beyond the sea. It's not too far for us. We can be able to actually access it. Those are the 4 points here. Again, one is that it's actually not too confusing. You can see the highlights here in Hebrew and in English. It's not beyond reach. It's not in the heavens, and it's not beyond the sea. We can access it. And I think part of the beauty of camp that we are not going to be able to access in the same kind of way this summer is that the experience of camp, of experiencing Judaism in such a positive, beautiful way in Sarvash, is that it is accessible to something that we can actually be able to reach. Let's now take a look. We have a couple of minutes left at the last 2 sources here that we have. It's actually one comes from the same part, from Shmot, from the book of Exodus. And again, the question here is what should each of our own relationship be to Torah? So let's look here together. Moshe went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, quote, all the things that the Lord actually has commanded us, we will do. And again, talking about the idea from earlier about all of the people. Vaya'an kol ha'am kol echad. It's a beautiful idea. I actually did not highlight that originally. I'm going to highlight that for you now so you can see it here, right? That all of the people, right, answered, all of the nation with one voice. It's even different than ish echad belev echad, as one people in one nation, but in some way they answered in one voice. Can we imagine what does that mean to answer as a nation in one voice? It's a very interesting thing to think about. And what did they say? They said, all the things that you command, we will do. Na'aseh. Now let's look a few verses later in verse 7, in Pasuk Zayin. It says here, then he took the record of the covenant and read it aloud to the people, and they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Very important. It says here in Hebrew, Vayomru kol asher diber Hashem naaseh v'nishma. Want to look down at the question here if it's not clear to you in the text. But let's take a look at question 2 and 3, and then we can go back to 1 in just a moment. In verse number 3, it says again about the whole nation answering with one voice, and we could spend the whole hour together just on that question about what does it mean to be a nation that responds in one voice. But what I want to actually look at and ask you, and again, feel free to write in the chat on Facebook. I encourage you to write, what is the difference between verse 3 and verse 7? The people say, Naaseh, we will do. And in verse 7, it says, Naaseh v'nishma, right? We will, and that's classically interpreted in a little bit of a different way than it's actually translated here, right? We will do and we will listen. The translation here actually says, has spoken and we will faithfully do. Naaseh v'nishma. I want you to think about a little bit, what is the difference between just doing and faithfully doing? What is the difference between actually accepting and actually calling ownership to Torah, calling ownership to this experience, not just right as doing, but as actually faithfully doing? And again, Naaseh v'nishma is classically understood here as actually hearing, right, as actually hearing what, as actually like doing and then listening, which is also a whole different conversation that could be had here about how the people like said, we will do and then we will listen, or to do something faithfully. I pose those questions out to everybody here. Again, if you're also here, feel free to unmute yourself, and you feel free also to comment as well. But also in the chat in Facebook, I'm curious to hear what people think is the difference between Naaseh and Naaseh v'nishma. To do something faithfully, or just to do something, and to do something and then listen versus actually just doing something. And the question 1 here about not in the heavens, we're not going to delve into that now. We talked about that a few minutes ago, but I kind of want to sort of close this piece to come back to that Vaya'an kol ha'am kol echad. And all of the people answer with one voice. And I think it's a big question, like, what does that mean, one people and one voice? I often feel for myself on a very personal level as we come towards the end of this time together, for me, being in Sarvash and being part of the community of Sarvash and being part of that incredibly unique and really, really special place that all of you feel really connected to, is that it is a place that we all come from different places. We practice in different kinds of ways. We do things in different kinds of ways. But in the end of the day, the beauty of the experience of Sarvash is actually kol ha'am kol echad, that we are one people and one voice, that we create a community. We create an experience to bring people together from across the world, speaking different languages, practicing in different kinds of ways, and being able to actually create that kind of a moment. And I think that's part of the beauty of the camp. And again, it's out there, right? We will not have it this year, as many other people in camps will not have. But it's something that we know and that we can access because it's so true to who all of you and who all of us are. In closing here, I put a few closing questions here to everyone. As the hour soon comes to a close, we'll close here in just a couple of minutes. Here's some concluding thoughts and questions that hopefully you can be able to enter into Shavuot thinking about. What is the significance of the actual single voice at the moment of Sinai, right? Ish echad b'lev echad, as one people and one heart, right? And also the idea here that we talked about, right? Vayan kol ha'am kol echad, one people, one voice. Like, why is that part of this actual experience, actually of Sinai? And something that I'll add here that just came to mind is that it's talking a lot here about nation. But I think what's so beautiful is the word echad appears over and over again, because it's not just about kind of like, taking yourself and just putting yourself in this group or in this nation and kind of like absolving, who you are as a person. But this actual experience and all of this is about ourselves and is about taking our own ownership over our own relationship and connection to Torah. And that's what re-experiencing the moment of Sinai should really be all about reconnecting to that moment, reconnecting to that experience of Sinai and thinking about our own relationship together with that. So again, around a single voice, either you as like an individual person and you as being part of a larger nation or people or community as well. Question 2, here. What did the experience of the wilderness teach us about the Sinai experience? You could be able to scroll back here in the text or to go back here in the audio, actually here a little bit later, right? It called out to us in the midrash, right? To actually make yourself like to be kind of like the wilderness. Like, think about what it might mean to actually put yourself in that place. What are the characteristics of the wilderness? Number 3, why does the Torah use the term this day, right? Bayom Hahu, in relation to the Sinai experience, that it's not on that day, but on this day, because it's about re-experiencing that moment, right, of of the revelation of Kabbalat Torah, of receiving the Torah. Number 4, why the multi-sensory experience? What does it mean to see what we hear, right? Why create an experience that's so intense, so wild, so out of the norm? Like, that's also camp, right? We leave our quote normal life to be in a different kind of world and experience, right? Why create those kinds of experiences for ourselves? What is it about camp that actually allows us to connect to something a little bit different? It's similar to Sinai in that way, that we're stepping out of our usual life to be part of this different world and all-encompassing experience. And I'll close with this question to everyone. In what way this Shavuot can all of us be able to actually develop a closer connection to the actual study of Torah? It was really wonderful. Thank you all for this opportunity to be able to connect with all of you. I hope there were people who clicked in and listened. If you click in and listen later, and I really encourage everyone, enjoy the holiday of Shavuot. Eat some great dairy foods, blintzes, ice cream, whatever. Stay up and study. There's some great stuff happening all around the world. I can see tomorrow night, all different kinds of experiences are out there. Or do it on your own. What does it mean to actually re-experience the moment of Sinai? And the challenge to all of us is actually, how do we not just re-experience it, but as I talked about actually earlier, how do we take ownership over it for ourselves? Feel free to reach out to me through private message, through comment, through whatever, through Facebook. And I'm happy to continue the conversation together with all of you. And again, if for some reason you're just clicking in now, you can be able to click on top to be able to access these sources in the post on top. Thank you all so much.